I remember you said, kind of how horrible the experience was being in there, but once the akathisia kind of went away, it was almost like therapeutic for you. It was a sanctuary because you're kind of there to you're pretty much born again. You're experiencing things for the first time again. And so I assume, yes, once you were released and once everything was pretty much back to normal, I'm sure you hit the ground running in terms of the research you did and everything else you looked up. What was the most interesting or maybe damning thing that you found researching akathisia when you were finally able to really research again?
So when I was in the mental hospital, the psychiatric hospital the last time, um, and I was better, then the first thing I did was Google antidepressant side effects, and then I came across David Healy, who is well known for his books on the dangers of antidepressants, and I spoke to him, or I can't remember if I spoke to him then, but I certainly spoke to him a few weeks, months later, and possibly emailed him, and so started that research. And
Mm-hmm.
I remember saying to him, is it possible that the antidepressants could have caused this to me, with me? And he said, you're lucky that you didn't kill yourself or your children or both. And I remember that really stayed with me. And then around that time, I then started to do the research and realize that there are two ways that cause people to want to take their own lives or other people's lives. And there are basically two routes. It's either akathisia or serotonin syndrome. I think I had both of those at different times. I think possibly I had serotonin syndrome when I went into a delirium, but it was certainly mixed up with akathisia as well, because in that delirium, I, remember the agony of akathisia. I remember as well, there was a light bulb moment. This isn't so much about akathisia, but there was a light bulb moment when I read somebody else's account of antidepressant induced psychosis, and it was identical to mine. It was just terrifyingly similar. And I read many other accounts, many people who had killed somebody close to them, and it was the similarities with the psychosis that I had was just was terrifying. It was all about violence, all about seeing yourself as if looking down, thinking that
Mm-hmm.
a feeling of being in a dream or a video game. That was how it was for me. It was like nothing really mattered. So there was that, and then of course the whole thing about akathisia was fascinating to me because it explained everything that had been going on, the walking around streets at night, the inability to sit still, the agony of it, um, and the accounts of people who had taken their lives because of akathisia. And it just led me to to an absolute passion to tell people about this, because it just became so obvious to me that suicides that were being people were thinking, oh, these people are taking their lives because they're depressed. It became obvious to me that there were a lot of people who were taking their lives because they had akathisia. And the reason I knew it was because I had it. And actually, in much of that year, I remember when I had, well, mild-ish akathisia. So not when I was in the kind of like toxic delirium or whatever, but there was throughout that year when I was at the hospital, I just remember so many times just wanting to jump under a train. My mind was sort of thinking, there's no reason for this. I don't have anything really to be depressed about. But it was like I just wanted to end some kind of physical agony, which of course was the akathisia.
Mm-hmm.
But it really was like there was this voice in my head saying, you've got to end it, end it. And I just know 100% that it was the drugs. I just know that. because that voice has never been there before or since. And that feeling of physical agony and wanting to end my life because of, not because of a kind of rational reason of, you know, any, there was no rational reason for it. I mean, it was frustrating because people, you know, because throughout that time, people were kind of like, well, yeah, no, she's feeling suicidal because, you know, her marriage is broken up and da 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 da. Da. And it was just frustrating because I was like, I didn't give a fuck about that. You know, before I was fine with that. You know, I had 8 months of being great with that, and I'm still fine with that. The reason that I'm suicidal is because there's something going on with me chemically. There's some kind of chemical alteration that is happening in my body and in my brain, and I have this compulsion to want to jump under a train or jump off a building or do something to end this intolerable feeling that I have. And it's hard to explain to people, and I find it so distressing to hear accounts of people who have taken their lives who had absolutely no history of mental illness. And it's just, to me, quite obvious that, you know, that it was because of akathisia. You know, I have become, I suppose, quite an expert in knowing the signs of a sort of akathisia-induced suicide.
Mm-hmm. And I know you're kind of talking about that chemical imbalance that you had. At what point, I assume when you were doing your research, but at what point did you kind of have that genetic testing done?
So I did that when I was writing. So I wrote a book about my experience, and as
Mm-hmm.
that, I spoke to one of the researchers who is at the forefront of that, Omar Eichenboom. And so I had the test done then, and yes, I'm a low metabolizer.
You know, it's so much. It's like you've been through so much, and obviously it's such a horrible experience. But it's so interesting in a way. It's like I can imagine after going through all that and then coming out of it, you know, you being the journalist you are, it's almost like, wow, there really is something here to tell, you know, and I'm sure before you did the research, part of you was probably thinking, yeah, there's a bunch of people who are going through the exact same thing, you know, because now I've experienced it and now I see that in a totally different way, you know. So did that kind of lead to you? Did that kind of interest in like hearing other stories and getting different perspectives and whatnot lead to you co-founding your website, antidepressantrisks.org?
Yeah. Okay. Well, so
Mm-hmm.
there was so I came out of the hospital, and I was sort of, you know, a bit like, you know, Bambi, trying to find my feet, trying to kind of understand all of this and trying to kind of rebuild my life, because at the time, of course, nobody was saying, oh, it's the drug, she's fine now. Everybody was going, she's mentally unstable. And there was a real fear that I would not have my children. And so what was important was getting it, you know, I very quickly went back to work, didn't tell anybody about what had happened, and got up, you know, rented a house so that my kids would have somewhere for Christmas. And I got my health back very quickly. So I started training for a half marathon, and I became really, really interested in this whole area. And so I went on this journey of discovery and realized that there were many people that had written about this. And so me and my kids went on, you know, we shared the journey together, because they also I wanted them to understand what had happened to their mum. I wanted them to know that it was the drugs, and that there wasn't a chance that I was going to suddenly, you know, become a knife wielding maniac overnight unless somebody, you know, slipped Prozac into my drink. So that was important to me. And so there were a lot of accounts that I saw, and as well, it was part of my healing as well to meet and talk to some of the people that had gone through this, some of the people that had written books. there was Rebecca Beddoe from Australia who had written a book, Dying for a Cure. And so it was like, I was so keen to connect with anybody that had experienced this. And remember, it was at the time really before Facebook groups or whatever. And I remember there was nothing, there was just nothing. There was no support groups. There was literally, there was David Healy. There were a few experts out there and one or two books. So I gently was putting my story out there on the internet, because I ran a half marathon for David Healy's charity Risk. As a result of that, a few people started coming out of the woodwork and contacting me. And I started to realize that this was, that, I wasn't the only one. There were more people out there. And I was so determined to get this. I mean, I felt like I knew something that the world had to know, which is that I felt genuinely blessed that when I'd taken that drug, that I hadn't killed my children. I really did. I absolutely knew in my heart of hearts that that was could have been a real possibility, that it may have ended very, very differently. That when I had those hallucinations about killing the children and stabbing myself, it could have easily gone the other way. I could have killed them and thought I'd stab myself. It could have gone any way. And also at the time, I became friends with someone who I'm sure you will know, David Carmichael, whose story had ended very differently. So he had had an antidepressant-induced psychosis, and he had taken the life of his son, Ian. So I was really aware that this was an issue, that I was very, very lucky that I had this knowledge. I was determined to get it out as a documentary. That proved to be very, very hard at the time. So then I decided, to cut a long story short, I wrote my book, effectively. And the book came out, which was then, the research was then bought by the BBC, and then it was eventually made into a documentary, the Panorama, A Prescription for Murder. I had a very good agent who was very brave as well, and a publisher that was very brave to publish the book, and it was heavily legaled. And I got onto a big kind of, it had a lot of publicity. So I got onto ITV's, one of the network's biggest morning programs. And I shared my story. And as a result, I was just inundated with people, inundated. I remember the Daily Mail ran the story. I was just inundated by people to whom the same thing had happened, or people who had lost loved ones, etc., etc.
Wow.
So then I started a website called thepillthatsteals.com, and then I didn't, then that changed in lockdown. I just thought, actually, it doesn't really, I needed a title that was more generic and that was more what was on the tin, said what it was on the tin, if you see what I mean. And I realized that, I wanted to collaborate with people that were experts, such as David Healy. So I set up Antidepressant Risks. The idea was that the main thing that I wanted, of course, there were lots of campaigning organizations and so on. What I wanted to bring to the party was somewhere where people could share their stories. So the centerpiece was the Stolen Lives pages, where people can share the story of somebody that they have loved and lost to antidepressants. And as well, people share their stories of being harmed. So that's the main, that was the main centerpiece, the main idea behind what I wanted to bring to this area, really. And it just expanded from there. I've been blessed with the fact that we now have a team of volunteers, one of whom has assiduously gathered every film known to man on antidepressants. So we have the largest virtual film library of films on antidepressants. And we also do support groups, online support groups, and of course our our in-person event, the Stolen Lives picnics.